Welcome to Leicester, to those of you who are not from Leicester, and welcome to everybody from the institution. My name's Henrietta O'Connor. I'm a Professor of Sociology and I'm Head of the College of Social Sciences, Arts and Humanities. I'm delighted to welcome you to this lecture today, which is part of a public lecture series being run by the University of Leicester School of Business. It's amazing for me to see today such a varied audience. There are a lot of faces I don't recognise, but there are equally a lot of faces I do recognise. And what is striking is the interdisciplinary nature of the audience we have here, which I think reflects very well what we're going to hear more about this afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this event, the world of business on I can't ever say this word, on an Anthropocene Earth. With human activities now playing an integral and an ever-increasing role in the functioning of our Earth system, this topic could scarcely be more important. We need to understand and respond to the challenges that are arising due to our dramatically changed relationship with our environment. We need to do this urgently, and we need to do this across disciplinary, socio-political and geographical boundaries, which is why, on behalf of colleagues in the interdisciplinary Leicester Institute for Advanced Studies and our schools of business, geography, geology and the environment, and media, communications and sociology, I'd like to welcome Professor Bruno Latour. It's a huge honour for us to welcome such an eminent academic to the University of Leicester, and we're delighted that you're here today. As a sociologist, I'm particularly delighted to welcome Professor Latour to Leicester, which, as many as you will know, was home to one of the first departments of sociology in the UK, and which has hosted many big names in sociology over the years. We're thrilled to add Professor Latour to that list, if only for today. Professor Latour is now a retired professor, but is far from retired. He's written and edited more than 20 books and published more than 150 articles. And he's pioneered work in a way that has galvanised minds, bodies and hearts across the globe. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes before I hand over just to give you some biographical notes about Professor Latour. He was born in Burgundy to a wine-growing family. He trained first as a philosopher and then as an anthropologist. From 1982 to 2006, he was professor at the Centre for the Sociology of Innovation in Paris, and from 2006 to 2017 at Sciences Po. After field studies in Africa and California, he specialised in the analysis of scientists and engineers at work. In addition to work in philosophy, history, sociology, and the anthropology of science, he's collaborated on many studies in science policy and research management. In a series of books, he's been exploring the consequences of science studies on different traditional topics of the social science, such as religion and social theory. For those of you interested in the lighter side of his work, his book, Paris, the Invisible City, is a collection of photographic essays on the technical and social aspects of the city of Paris. After fieldwork in one of the French Supreme Courts, he published his monograph, The Making of Law, an ethnography of the Council d'État, a new presentation of social theory, which he has developed with his colleagues in Paris, is available at the Oxford University Press under the title Reassembling the Social, an Introduction to Actor Network Theory. More and more interested by political ecology questions, he's published Facing Gaia, 8 lectures on the new climatic regime in 2015, and Down-to-Earth Politics and the New Climatic Regime in 2018. While in Sciences Po, he created the Media Lab to seize the chance offered to social theory by the spread of digital methods, and he's more recently developed a new experimental programme in art and politics. Having been awarded an ERC grant to pursue an inquiry into modes of existence, he's recently been engaged in the AIM project. So without further ado, friends and colleagues, please join me in welcoming Professor Bruno Latour.
I have no slides. I apologize.
If you would like to say
and I'd like to dedicate this lecture to the memory of a philosopher, a French philosopher who is not maybe so well known. He deserves to be better known. But he did a lot for the link between science and the humanity, namely Michel Serres, who died on Saturday, and who wrote a book called The Natural Contract, which in a way anticipated many of the things which are now called the Anthropocene. I'm not going to have to defend the name Anthropocene, which is attacked by many people, including many of my friends. And as you will see in one of the works of art which will be shown tonight, there is now more than 100 names with "scene" at the end. People are playing with it, but here, since we are in Leicester with the source, the mecca of a fountainhead of the knowledge on the Anthropocene, I will keep the name in the unadulterated version that Jan Zalasiewicz and his colleagues have shown to the world. So I'll keep the word Anthropocene. I will not try to talk about the Stutulocene or the Capitalocene or all of the other 100 names. I'm going to talk about what's the subject of the Anthropocene in a way. That is, what is the type of subjectivity which is associated with the discovery of the Anthropocene by the Anthropocene Study Group. So I'm not going to talk, of course, about geology. I learn and read with great avidity the papers coming from the group, but I cannot talk about them. I'm going to talk about the effects that are necessary to cope with the harsh news of the Anthropocene, with this idea that basically believing or following the work of the study group as a strange way of making us first mad, and on the other trying to get a new form of subjectivity. I'm not going to talk about great scheme. I'm going to talk about two of the projects in which I'm engaged, which is the only way I can bring some insight to the question of the day, which is business and the Anthropocene. And I know even less about business than I know about the Anthropocene. And from the wine family, that's all about it. And there is a connection between geology and wine, of course, but even that there I'm not expert except at drinking it, probably. So there are two topics which I'm trying to get at in order to swallow, so to speak, the question of the Anthropocene and measure the effect which are triggered by it. One of them is an exhibition I'm doing in May 2020 called Critical Zone, the Science and Politics of Landing on Earth. I will talk about it. And the other one is a lecture play or theater play, which is a parallel between two moments in history where the Earth was sent moving, so to speak. One of them associated with the figure of Galileo, and the other one with the figure of James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, which I try to connect together. So this is what I will try to interest you in. And I will start with the Galileo versus Lovelock-Margulis parallel. The reason is that, as you know, I'm sure there is an extraordinary play by Bertolt Brecht, The Life of Galileo, which has shown in a beautiful way that if you begin to modify the way the Earth is moving, all sorts of other things in the social order are becoming unsettled and create a lot of transformation and drama in a way which is not dissimilar from the one we are undergoing today. So the ideal would be to write a life of Galileo, a write of Lovelock and Margulis, which would be a sort of parallel and a contrast, and as I will show, an inverse symmetry with the story of Galileo. Brecht was a communist, so he was very good at showing the connection between the cosmology and the social order. I mean, if you remember the play, it's all about the transformation in the way the church and the aristocracy and the exploitation of the workers was actually connected with a certain stable view of the cosmos, which was transformed the discovery of Galileo. And of course, from the point of view of Brecht, Galileo was a great hero, and all of these other guys who were resisting the new cosmology were old hat, so to speak, and they were archaic people who were thrown away. because I chose this example because of Michel Serres' death, because in a very beautiful moment in the natural contract, he contrasts the two revolutions, even though he doesn't talk directly about Lovelock, by saying in one case, Galileo is criticized and keeps saying, "E pole si muove," and yet the Earth, moves. And on the other side, the new trial of Lovelock and trial of the people like Jan Zalazewicz, it would be actually a nice play to do, the trial of Jan Zalazewicz, where you would have people condemning the Anthropocene stories and the study group for bringing all the story of geology to the interested gaze of ignorant people like me. And then you would have Jan getting out of a door and saying, and yet it is moved. I don't know if it works in English, but in French it works. Elle s'émeut, or elle se meut. Galileo say elle se meut, and Lovelock or Jan Zalazewicz would say elle s'émeut. It is moved. Does it work in English? It is moved? Okay. So these two people these two sort of revolutions are both indicating a transformation in the way the Earth behaves, so to speak. Now, what is really interesting for me is that these two revolutions are in fact very different. Because in the case of a Galileo revolution, we are told it's an immense transformation, but in fact it has no consequence apart from the calculation of astronomers to the daily life. It attracts the attention of the church, and everybody knows the story, and it's scenarized, it's put into stage by Bertolt Brecht as a major transformation in the cosmology and the social order, as you all know. So we are told that it has immense consequences on the cosmic and social order. And of course, the great result of that revolution is that Galileo is clearly the winner. And the old cardinals and all the people who were criticizing him are, of course, thrown in the dustbin of history. Now, on the other side, which is the reason why I'm interested, is that the discovery by, I call it the discovery by Lovelock and Margulis of what they call Gaia, if we want to be more close to the Anthropocene, the set of work done by the Anthropocene study group, have immense practical consequences, even though they are much less assimilated by the public as the Galilean revolution. So what is interesting here is that on the side of Galileo, you have a revolution which now everybody takes for granted, which has, they say, and Brecht says, enormous consequence, even though the consequences are largely on ideological ground and not in terms of the way we behave. The sun for every one of us still turns around the Earth very quietly every morning in practice. Even though the other revolution, the one which means that the Earth moves or is moved and has a way of reacting to our action, that modifies everything. And yet it's not assimilated, accepted, considered as a transformation, a major transformation in the cosmology and social order in the same way. So what is interesting is that the discovery of what is called, it's a traditional name in philosophy, Galilean object, has been considered as the great moment in the scientific revolution, but the discovery 4 centuries later of what I think would be called Lovelockian or Margulisian agents is a much more important revolution, still deep into doubt, and people have uncertainty about it, and has consequences on the way the political order should be reestablished much bigger. And here I'm connecting into the question of the day, which is that of business. It's fairly clear that there is a direct connection, which has been shown by many historians of science, between the Galilean revolution and what could be called, with lots of quotation marks, the advent of modern capitalism. In the same way as that there is a deep transformation and deep consequences between the discoveries of Margulis and Lovelock agent and reinvention, refoundation, we would learn that during the day, of what could be meant the system of production. For a very, very important reason, which I've been shown by many artists, which is that when you consider Galilean object, you see the Earth from above and from far away in an infinite and immense cosmic space. When you detect the agency of Lovelockian agent, you are seeing it from the inside. And that makes a big difference in the view of the Earth in both cases. So here we have a beautiful scene, so to speak, a beautiful way to stage a contrast between two very important moments in history of science around the theme, which is the same, which is moving Earth, basically. What change does it make to you if the Earth is moving under your feet? And of course, I'm giving here the gist of a story in very abstract terms, but in terms of dramatization in a Brechtian way, the effect I want to obtain for this play or lectures is that I want to put you in the shoes of people who, in 1610, in Venice, would have heard this strange guy, an engineer, what he's doing there, telling you that the Earth is moving, and that when it moves, it means you have no place, and the cardinals will tell you that, and a stage, a very beautiful moment in the play of Brecht, that God will not be able to see me anymore because I'm sort of turning out a stone in an infinite space. And all dramatization has been made about that. And of course, the great modernist idea about this episode, very tragic episode, is that the human who is able to think of himself in this infinite universe reduced to nothing is actually enormous because of his intelligence and his science. So the great scene of the sublime is invented at this period where the human is reduced to nothing in terms of an infinitely small element into the planet, which is itself nothing but a small dust in the infinite universe, but expanding enormously because of its science and wisdom. So that the sublime of a scientific revolution introduced by Galileo. And people who see the Brecht play, it's constantly replayed, have no doubt that Galileo is the hero. But I'd like to ask you what it means if you are hearing people like the Anthropocene Study Group accumulating evidence that the Earth is moving in this other sense, and that you are responsible for it, and that you are not too happy with this idea that your cosmology and your social order is actually being threatened and destroyed. And you cannot look at my play by saying, well, of course I know who is the hero, because you don't know if Lovelock and Margulis are that big heroes. You might think Jan Zelazevic is a hero, but not be sure of it. So you would be put into a state of uncertainty very similar to the situation of uncertainty in which Florentine or Venetian could have been in 1610 hearing this strange idea about the Earth moving. So we are in this situation. And that's why it's much more interesting than the Galileo story, because the Galileo story is a done deal. But the Lovelockian, Margulis, Zalazievich, Anthropocene story, that's our situation. And we are uncertain about it. And we don't know how to cope. And you can imagine many consequences it has on the way we are trying to protect our social order against this destruction by the Earth moving in the same way as the Church and the Cardinal were trying to maintain their social order at the news of the Copernican revolution. I'm not talking because I don't want to pronounce the name of this man, but he's the head of the United States of America. Is actually your He's actually the guest of your queen, I think, today. Right? The interesting part in the stories of the other side, the Lovelockian Margulis, is that it's very, very difficult to maintain the notion of sublime. Because if a sublime invented first, which was the infinitely small element of a human in the universe compared to this expanded knowledge and science and wisdom, we, because of the accumulation of papers by Jan and his group, cannot play the same thing. Now the human is much too big, much bigger than what is expected. And actually a large source of skepticism about the Anthropocene is coming from the people who say, how could a human be that big? But on the other hand, no one today could celebrate the wisdom and immense beauty of science and capacity of human to cope with it. So the two main elements were organizing the sublime structure, infinitely small humans, infinitely great wisdom and science, are gone. Because now we are embarrassed twice. We are much too big on this earth. We didn't know we were that big, and we are much too small to have any sort of wisdom that we can be proud of it and boost. So this is the situation, the two contrasted positions where we are left. Now, the reason why I got interested into this parallel and contrast is because of a second enterprise, this exhibition about critical zone. Critical zone is a word introduced by some scientists to talk about the thin crust of the Earth and bring together all sorts of disciplines, which before geography, soil science, hydrology, and so on, have been geochemistry and work, but somewhat separately before. And for the last 5 years, as a sociologist of science, I followed this discipline. And I could have talked about that, but since it's about business, I have to shorten the description of critical zone to one essential part, which is critical zone is the place where we are supposed to land. And that's a strange new situation. Everything happened in the new situation introduced by the Anthropocene, as if we had to relearn what it is where we have to inhabit. So it's not only the discovery that the Earth is moving, is that we are suddenly surprised by the shape and the content and the ingredient of the Earth on which we are supposed to land. The French title of a book that is called Down to Earth was actually Where to Land, and I think it would have been a better title. The reason is that since the beginning of a so-called modern period, we are living on two different lands. One which is the official one, so to speak, the one where we gain our rights, where we have a jurisdiction, where we have a political system. But there is another earth, another land, so to speak, out of which we gain, to use the word of a young French philosopher called Pierre Charbonnier, our prosperity. So basically the whole movement of a modernist economy, if I summarize it, is an uplift between the two lands. The one we are aware of, that we can visualize, where we gain our freedom, have the definition of us as citizens, and then another land, which is the one we prosper from. And it has many names, of course. One of them, to use the expression of Pomerantz several years ago, is the notion of a ghost land, of a ghost acreage. And the best example he gives in his book, as you all know, even if you voted for the Brexit in one way or another, is that England, starting in the 1920s, had a real land, a juridical land, the land you live in, and then another land, the ghost land of Britain, which already was 3 or 4 times bigger in terms of acreage in 1920, and which is now immense, of course. Well, after the Brexit, of course, it will be much smaller, but that's another thing. So we live, we the European, we the Westerners, we the modern, live on two completely different lands which have completely different characteristics. The one which social science understand, the one which is the one connected to political science, to our whole energy as citizen, and another one which is the land out of which we get our prosperity. And as Pomeran said, coal and colonies. So this divide, I should be aware of that or not? No, it's just in case something completely different happened there. So it's one way of describing the work of the Anthropocene committee is in a way to say it describes a ghost land, if you want. So there's the land on which we live, and then there's ghost land. And suddenly, the people who are suddenly realizing that the two have to be brought together without crashing. That's what I call landing without crashing. Suddenly, we have to find a way where, suddenly we ask a question which it's very strange to imagine that we had not raised this question before. What is the exact shape of the land on which we are supposed to prosper and to survive? And the two have, of course, look very alien to one another and very strange. There is no way to reconcile the land imagined by social sciences and economy and the land in which we are supposed to land, because the land, the other one, is full of other entities, human and non-humans, which have new type and new sort of reaction and agency. And that's where I think there is a connection between my talk and the topic, even though I'm not sure if people in business studies will recognize it. But I'll try anyway. In the old days, there was an argument called socialism, where people were supposed to reconcile the two by getting into the description and definition of what they call system of production, and realizing that behind the official legal terminology, which had been basically built again by the British 17th century, Locke, etc., there was another continent which was called industry, engineering, production, social relations, social productive relations, out of which could be extracted simultaneously the understanding of what will become labor and the understanding of what would become classes and the famous class struggles. So the whole question of socialism was associated with this discovery. Now, my argument is that the way we now understand landing or overlapping and overlaying the land on which we are supposed to live as citizens and the land out of which we gain our prosperity raise a parallel question. Not only discovering a system of production, but what I would call in down-to-earth, don't have a very good word, the system of engendering. What is at stake in the system of production is resources and humans. What is at stake in the system of engendering is a doubt about the capacity of generating entities, no matter which entity we are talking about, human or non-human. And that's where the resources, political resources, could be found in the time of the Anthropocene. If I understood the topic of the day, not as extending business to green stuff, this is not the topic, right? Greenwashing extended to, no, this is not the topic. But if I understood as, is there a parallel between the new question of landing and the key question of socialism in the 19th century? It is not the discovery of industry and engineering and production, but the discovery of the same industry, innovation, technology, and production, plus all of the agents out of which we gain our prosperity. So we knew about the fact that there was resources necessary for production. But the learning, what is so extraordinary in what I call the new climatic regime, is the number of new agents and entities which we are now discovering are participating into the second world, that is the one out of which we gain our prosperity. So my argument is that in addition to, it's a parallel, if you want, it's a simile. What is the equivalent of a discovery of social classes and social struggle if we call them geosocial classes and geosocial struggle, which is the same question with a fabulous extension of the agents which are now necessary for our prosperity. If you understand, it's a way to give a whole talk about ecology without mentioning once the word ecology, where I mentioned it twice. And to raise the question of social justice by asking this question, which might look very strange at first: what is geosocial justice? So, and that will be the last part of my talk, which is, what is this new notion of agency given to a large numbers of non-humans who are part of this second world out of which we gain our prosperity before we bring the two together without crashing. Now here I need to do a parenthesis and go back to the history of Lovelock discovery of Gaia, because I think there is a very interesting historical element here. Even though in terms of historical narrative, the Anthropocene is just a very small period of geological history, as we learn from our friend geologist. In terms of the discovery of Gaia, it goes the other way. Lovelock discovery first is the Anthropocene, even though he didn't use the word, and then Gaia. And it has been shown by a very interesting thesis by Sébastien Dutreuil, a French historian of soil science and earth science, which has made a very deep inquiry into the archives of Lovelock, the whole archives is now in the British Science Museum. As you know, Lovelock, maybe not, because it's not something we know. Lovelock was first an analyst of very small amount of pollutants through highly sensitive instrument which he had invented and he was a specialist of. So what is very interesting is that if you look at the way Gaia came about, it was first of all as a sort of Anthropocene study of the way to detect pollutants, and even though he doesn't brag so much about it, Lovelock was actually financed by big industry, and there is a link with business from the start, for this ability to describe pollution. So in other words, the pollution is first, the industry is first, and when he gets, in the famous moment in Pasadena, and imagine what would be the Earth seen from Mars, the invention, which is so difficult for people to understand, is to say what happens to industry today, that is the ability to spread pollutants which are detectable by very fine instruments to the whole Earth. Life forms must have done that for a long time. So it's actually the discovery of Gaia is not Mother Earth or all these metaphors which are very, very misleading and with which Lovelock plays, it's true, but which are not very helpful. It's actually an Anthropocene discovery, very similar to the one coming from the Anthropocene study group, that basically life must have done this pollution from the beginning at an enormous scale. And that's when he meets Lynn Margulis, who was working at a very completely different scale, as you know, on the question of what the bacterial universe, and how the bacteria actually produce all of these pollutants, the most famous one being as everybody knows, the oxygen in the 2.5 billion period. So my point is this, is that when we consider the whole question of being submitted to the Anthropocene story is to find a way of reconciling our own vocabulary for agency, freedom, engineering, development, in continuity with what life forms can themselves, inside which life forms can be framed. The whole dispute around the Anthropocene is that it's extremely difficult to accept the idea that, which I call the loss of the sublime, in which we are simultaneously much too big and much too small, and when we are sort of dissolved. The question of a subjectivity of people resisting the Anthropocene is what I'm trying to get at. Now, it's very important and very interesting to realize that for Margulis and Lovelock, the invention of a Gaia phenomenon has nothing to do with a fusion into a whole cosmos or Mother Earth mega-organism, but in a very small, networky attitude where life forms end up from bacteria to the production and re-engineering of their condition of existence, like atmosphere, water, rocks, etc. So there is a very, this is always missed, this is why the reason I insist is that it's very difficult to gain a subjectivity adjusted to the Anthropocene news or discovery if we reuse the vocabulary and the intellectual resources coming from the old man in nature, whatever definition of nature that we had used before. We need to establish some continuity which would not be seen immediately as a naturalization and then the loss of agency that goes with it of a traditional way of entering into contact with natural science. If Anthropocene is disputed by my friends in anthropology, Donna Haraway, Isabelle Stengers, it's all because of that they are afraid that we are geologizing the human and the social sciences are squashed and disappear. And in social sciences, we have a long story of having been squashed, and not only by losing our budget, but also by having people from biology or economics or physics or whatever squeezing our agency to nothing. That's not the story. That's not the story which can be done when you get into the Lovelock-Margulis narrative, because it's rather an extension of a very connection between very small changes done by bacteria and the sort of global element like the atmosphere. This is what fascinates me, that this discovery of Gaia is exactly the opposite of a global story. It's the discovery of a fine connection, and the famous sentence by Margulis is that the people in geology, in atmospheric sciences, were wondering where the methane was coming from, and the people in biology were wondering who was producing the methane, and when they got together, suddenly something new clicked. But the newness of this discovery is something which I think has not been publicly registered, which is a continuity between the life forms, no matter if they are bacteria or if they are humans, engineering, all engineering, without any knowledge of what comes next, without any providence, without any sort of oikos, to use this word, which has a catastrophic effect on the definition of ecology, but something which, in a paper with Tim Lenton, we try to call freedom. And that's a direct consequence in the way we understand, I think, the notion of business, because it means that when we consider the connection between humans and non-humans, what is common is the notion of freedom. That is, engineering without knowing in advance what's going to happen, the consequence of your actions spreading, which is true of bacteria or true of human as well. Agency being shared with all these entities. So this was I think, an important element in the argument, going back to the discovery of Lovelock and Margulis. Actually, I don't know how you consider in this room, it's always difficult to talk about Gaia in a room where they are simultaneously natural scientists and social scientists, because people usually hate the notion of Gaia from both ends. And yet I keep getting at Gaia because I think it's a very interesting case of a discovery which has been made and yet not made. It's very strange. It's a discovery made which still requires its own understanding. And I think only, this is a private matter, but only people who are done through actor network theory can actually understand biology, but that's another question. It's a problem of the connection between the small and the big is actually not understandable by anyone who has not done actor network theory. Okay, to conclude. So I know nothing about business except family business, but I have to tell you a little anecdote here, which is that every year we have a family gathering for the Latour's wine. And 12 years ago, I got really hooked up seized by the question of what's going to be soon called the Anthropocene, because the man who was in charge of giving us the description of a time that the wine in Burgundy was going to undergo in the next following years, showed a slide showing that one of the great dangers that we had to be prepared for was the disappearance of the Gulf Stream. And I was completely struck. How could someone within a small village in the middle of Burgundy takes the disappearance of the Gulf Stream as a crucial element in the landscape, the mental and political landscape inside which wine growing in Burgundy has to be settled? And for me, it was a very revealing experience, because then suddenly the connection between business, very practical question, investment on 50 years in grapes and so on, was being connected. So this is a very nice case for the lending, is that we in Burgundy had to relearn the very content, the very components of the beings that make up the land on which we are supposed to land. Of course, everybody who has done anything in wine knows that there is a link, as I said in the beginning, between geology and agriculture, but nothing like what is now the Anthropocene consequence on business. Because the difference is the agency given to this entity which are reacting back to us. That has nothing to do with production. It's not a question of extracting resources. These entities react to our action. They have agency. And the whole field of critical zone, the whole paradigm of this new science of critical zone is an accumulation of novelty and of scientific news about those agencies striking back. And in a way, the whole frame of the Anthropocene is that the Earth is not the place where we sit, it's the place that is actually acting against and with us eventually as much. So you see the parallel. I'm trying to understand, to push here the parallel between the realization in the 19th century that there is a whole, in addition to the liberal order which had been invented in the century before, there is a whole practical, material reason and consequences for an economy to work. Here, of course, Marxism was very important, and that we have to redescribe for beginning to notice where people are in what was called the system of production. And now there is the same huge transformation, the same huge, except, of course, the liberal order which we thought had disappeared is actually much stronger now than it was in the 19th century. This is a great Karl Polanyi's question. But we are exactly in the same situation, except the immensity of the number of agents that have to be into account, the strangeness of their agency, but also the possibility of agency have to be, again, analyzed and studied and elicited, not only by scientists, but also by militant activists, farmers, everybody else, so to speak. But the parallel is very striking between the two, except it has nothing to do with production. The whole socialism after the 19th century became a sort of slightly boring question of redistributing the wealth of a production. But that's not the question today in the Anthropocene business. The question is not to distribute production, the wealth of production. It's to go back. Why is it production? Why is production the only way we entertain connection between human and animal? And that's why I think it's very interesting to try to imagine that there is, it's not a crisis in system of production, it's a crisis between system of production and something which has to do with, I can't find a better word, engendering, where the question is much more general, is how do you keep having an earth? How do you keep having insects, earthworms, as well as, of course, the whole question which are still there of the social justice. But to social justice expanded by another round to geosocial justice is the big problem. And I want to close with, I can't help, a small moment on the Brexit fiasco. Not because it's a fiasco, which it is, but just because of a difference between the Brexit question 3 years ago and the Brexit now. I'm not talking about the masses of political dispute. I'm talking about the difference there is between asking a question in terms of identity, do you want to be in or out of Europe, and a question about attachment. Whom do you depend and what do you depend on to live on? And I was very struck that the experiment, it's a very beautiful experiment that Great Britain underwent in the last 3 years. And I think it has to be celebrated. No, I'm not kidding. I mean, it has to be celebrated. But the whole people, don't forget that for a European like me, the biggest manifestation in favor of Europe had been taken place in London, not anywhere else. So we are very grateful to the European people in Britain. They underwent exactly the shift I'm interested in, going from a definition in terms of identity, where do you live, do you want to be in and out, to a question of attachment. How many elements, what's the list of entities with which you depend on to live? With the extraordinary moment when one of your ministry in charge of a negotiation had to discover that trucks were necessary to go from Douvres to Calais. And he had to confess in Parliament that I discovered that trucks were necessary to actually go through the channel. I mean, it was for me a great moment, because that's the shift from identity, which is of course the great purview now of what is called populist party, to a completely different question, which is the interesting question. That's the question of where do you depend? What is the land on which you live? Which is different, of course, because identity defines only one of these two lands. I want to stay in Britain and don't move. But if you ask the question, what do you depend on to live in Britain? Then suddenly, day after day, we learn that you need trucks, you need legislation from Europe, you need trade with Vietnam, etc., etc. So there is no connection between the land on which we imagine our identity and the land where we gain our prosperity. And the reason why we should celebrate the Anthropocene Study Group, I think, is because of that they make us understand the detail, again, of the land in which we are going to land, and hopefully without crashing. Thank you very much.
A very good afternoon to all of you. Let me introduce myself. My name is An. I'm ambassador of Vietnam to UK. And it's great honor and pleasure for me to be invited to research week at Leicester, bringing together international renowned scholars like Professor Bruno Latour and international researchers. I understand that during the course of this week, you are going to discuss pressing issue in the age of Anthropocene, I don't know whether I pronounce it nicely, rightly, but the issue like climate change, nurturing innovation, economic management, and capacity building, etc. That's a very relevant issue. And I'm extremely happy that among the participants to the workshop, there are 5 young researchers from Vietnam. So in this connection, I would like to express our sincere thanks and appreciation to Leicester University, Professor Marta, the British Academy, and the University of Economic of Ho Chi Minh City, and the Vietnam Ally, who collaborate close together to bring the Vietnamese researchers to this important workshop. And I think those issues are going to discuss in the next few days. Not only relevant to you, but I think it's very extremely relevant for Vietnam. As you know, Vietnam is one of the countries who will be most vulnerable to the climate change. You also know that Vietnam, after many years of wars and devastation, so we need to start from the scratch. So how to nurture and develop innovation, how to make the capacity building is extremely important for Vietnam if we want to catch up with the rest of the world. So I think this workshop will be very beneficial to our Vietnamese colleague here. And let me touch a little bit on the bilateral relations. As you may be well aware, Vietnam and UK are strategic partners. And over the course of the recent years, the bilateral relations between the two countries has developed rapidly, at length and in depth. And I can say that never before the relation between the two countries is so good. And education is also considered as one of the top priority in our strategic partners. So I think with this work done by Leicester University, I would very much would like to see in future many researchers and scholars from Vietnam would come over here to UK to have the exchange, to learn from your experience. But also I would like to see the British and UK researchers to Vietnam to do the joint work together. I can tell you that now Vietnam is developing quite rapidly. Our GDP growth is average 7%, one of the highest growth in the world. Our population is quite young, over 50% of our population is under the age of 35. So the demand for university, for higher education and for research and development is quite high, with a market and with a population of 100 million people. So I think there's a lot we can cooperate together. And over the lunch, Professor Latour has asked me if Brexit has any effects on Vietnam and bilateral relations. I say that no matter the outcome of Brexit, but one thing that can be sure that the relations between the two countries could only go from good to better. So I'm quite confident that we can cooperate a lot in the future. And last but not least, I will not take your more time, but I wish your workshop will be crowded with success, and I will welcome you to Vietnam either for intellectual work or for leisure. And thank you very much. And,
friends and members of the audience, colleagues, it's always humbling to be in the same room as Jan and Bruno. And I will try my best today. My name is John Palmesino. I'm an architect and urbanist. I'm going to try to take on the challenge and that I was somehow given to come up with some provocations after a speech by Bruno, which is almost impossible. So I thought that instead of provocations, I will try to do a series of intimations. And the intimations are really about how we can articulate the landing project of Bruno from our business, which is architecture, which is a very exotic practice, in particular in this country. Architecture is really a relationship between a material space and a polity. And we are undergoing major upheavals in both. And so how can we reconnect? How do we recompose the two in order to land safely? And this is just a list of the projects that we are conducting at Territorial Agents. But the intimation that I wanted to start with is really to start thinking the great transformation that Karl Polanyi described in his undertaking of the history of the market societies as an undoing of the land, as an undoing of this particular England. And the great transformation is nothing else in Polanyi's world than the construction of a market society by expelling markets, marketplaces, markets as sites of reciprocity, sites where people can exchange ideas and knowledge and the produce of the land. By expelling that particular space from our lives, you create a market force. Or, in other words, you create the world system that Bruno somehow related to in an idea of socialism, in the sense that it's the modern project of the economy. But the earth is simply forgotten. The land that has been taken out is gone. And what counts is really the numbers on your banknotes, or whether those banknotes have a denomination like euro. God forbid. The other element that is crucial in understanding the great transformation is that the transformation comes in waves. And this may be the great work of Schumpeter, the idea of destructive capitalism. You have a great wave of innovation, a great wave of business that is conducive to nothing else than changing what you're already doing, which then has consequences much later. And he discovered, of course, the great waves, the Kondratiev wave and the secular wave, well beyond the business cycle. And the question, of course, that has been dismissed by many economists and many businessmen is whether these are real or not. But the most important intimation that I wanted to bring to the table is to have the courage to think that models, mathematical models that conduct our lives, are so entrenched with the idea of the world systems as opposed to the earth system. So what we are conducting our entire life along is a mathematical model. So how do we go from a mathematical model-driven economy, a society driven by mathematical models, to one that is connected to land? And the way through which I would intimate us to think of this is through territories that need to be understood in the way that they are cut across, the way that they are weighing in one on top of the other, and how they relate to a particular form of energy transformation. This is, of course, our global energy assessment. It's actually 2012, so it's quite late. But it shows that since 1850, since the moment when this country was fully industrialized, and the year before the exhibition in London with the Crystal Palace, we've gone from around 56 exajoules globally to around 560. This is the great transformation that Polanyi was describing most possibly, and it's, of course, completely connected to the great transformation that Jan and his amazing friends and colleagues are describing in the very detailed working of where is that strata. For us, that big transformation is nothing else than a succession of territories, a succession of different ways of organizing the relationship between a polity and a particular space of operation, a material basis, in terms of metabolism, in terms of transformation of energy. In this case, in terms of transformation of energy that it doesn't come from net primary production only, but from fossil fuels. And we start seeing that the large acceleration is nothing else than a series of other waves that go from moving from small cities and towns surrounded by large forests into large organizations that need parliaments in order to organize the bureaucracy of moving around coal and the entire industrial system associated with that. And then we need to have another leap in order to start understanding another transformation of a territory, the international. And that international is nothing else than a way to deal with the protection of the means of production, the property structures of the oil industry. And today we are going through probably another major territorial transformation where the production that is appropriated not by those who have natural resources, but by augmenting production even further by China and India. So the question is, and the intimation is, how do we understand this succession as an architectural project? An architectural project that we can actually design and rearticulate on the ground. The difficulty, of course, in England is to think it in terms of what this land is. This land is, of course, not land, it's sea. England, contrary to the understanding of many English, it's sea. And mainly, it is the continental shelf. Not the English continental shelf, not the British continental shelf, but the invention of ruling the sea as if it were land. And the invention is, of course, done by one gentleman, together with some. And that particular way of thinking that the waves are what we rule is somehow the major difficulty at the moment in landing. Because the moment that we think that there's just a sky or there's just an ocean to land and that ocean is infinite, we're actually missing the point and the major point of understanding the sea, the earth, rather than understanding the world. We only encounter its surface. We only ever encounter this space as a space of extension. It never goes deep into the bottom of the sea, never articulates the difficulty of understanding the ocean as one of the major lively conditions of the universe. The ocean is alive. Not that there is life in the ocean is alive. So how can we think of fixing that space as the great economists of this country would have done, by parceling it and extracting it, rather than thinking it as an active source. The consequences of what happens on the bottom of the sea are linked directly to what happens on the surface of the land. This is London seen across 3 decades over satellite imagery. And you see all these lights is the brighter there are, and the more changes there have been. The different colors show you when things have happened. You can see how much activity there is, a lot of roof being changed, a lot of transformation happening out there on your left, which is Heathrow, a big change happening along the docks, the sea, import, export. That is what people think in terms of business, but actually import and export is nothing else than moving things. And one of the little exercises that we've been doing recently has been calculating how lighter Britain became during the Industrial Revolution and how heavier it's becoming now. We used to export so much, now we have to import so much. How much? Where is the new import? Where does it go? Where does this material flux of the city and the energy flux of the contemporary space that we need to reorganize as a polity find place? We can look at other metropolitan areas. We can look at their logistics. We can look at their structures of business-friendly or anti-business friendly. But in any case, and this is a little homage to Bruno, of course, it's Paris. What we will end up having is that the European cities, including the British ones, are nothing else than large, quasi-stable aggregates with some little changes here and there. In this case, of course, the Louvre has been repaved many times. You can see it brightly shining. What happens in Paris is mainly around the Boulevard Périphérique and the large extension of the infrastructure of the airports. So when we're thinking of a project like Bruno's, of seeing business and the earth from within in this country, what I find particularly difficult is really the fact that the intimation comes always in abstract terms. We always think business in abstract terms, and then we have a problem in thinking what happens to the high streets, what happens to business in the city of London. I'm very happy that Your Excellence is here. We had Vietnamese students a couple of years ago, and he endeavored for 1 year studying the ongoing relationship between guild houses in the city of London and the contemporary international business centers. The actual buildings are the same. The actual structures where these things happen are the same. As an architect, I find the long-term transformations of a place like Britain really fascinating. But the intimation that comes from Bruno, from Jan and the Anthropocene Working Group, Mark is in the room, and many others I see, is not to think them as objects on a space, not as objects in an inert space, but to completely change perspective and to start thinking that those transformations are nothing else than material fluxes, engaging other material and energy fluxes that are part equally of life. All of this stuff that we're moving around is a spin-off of the biosphere. It's a spin-off of life, of our life. And how to consider that as part of life is the most difficult element in our mind. And I'm not so sure if the light will be able to highlight this. This is a little image from our friend, the Vietnamese student. It's the structure of the villages of England. And each one of these little pink dots is constantly engaging in thinking how not to change, how to remain the same, how not to allow anyone enter their territory. So the intimation in thinking the territorial transformations and the architecture of the, if I could say so, of down to earth is to give up idea of conservation of those architectures in order to transform radically the way through which we do business. Or in other terms, how do we become more anxious about things? Because that, in my understanding, is what business means, to be anxious. Yet, it might not be timely to do it. We might not be in a situation to simply change a little bit here, hanger there in our structures, because the Earth is changing much quicker than we have time to change our economy. And this is the problem. We can, on one side, we'll have to adopt an attitude of giving up business as usual. That means we have to give up conservation. We have to give up transformations. We have to give in to transformations against our will of not changing anything. And at the same time, we'll have to protect as much as we can. And that is the moment, the intimation that I wanted to bring in today, to start thinking of the project of being within the Earth as a simultaneous idea of conservation and transformation. And we will have to make very difficult choices about the elements that we need to keep and the elements that we want to give up. And I would really intimate us to give up our stuff in order to keep our lives. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Steve Brown, formerly of this parish, currently at the Open University. It's a real delight to be able to respond very, very briefly to Professor Latour's lecture. I'm going to make a few remarks and then we're going to open up to questions. So start gestating your questions now. Professor Latour has already remarked upon the sad passing of Michel Serres, an astonishing figure in philosophy for the past 50 years. This is a Goya painting, Fighting with Cudgels, that Serres places at the start of his magnificent book, The Natural Contract, which Professor Latour discusses quite widely in Facing Gaia and other places. And although Professor Latour has given us a lot in the Anglophone social science world, an enormous amount, one of those things is to have properly introduced Michel Serres' thinking into Anglophone social science. So the use Serres makes of this image is to say, well, what are we drawn to? We're drawn to these two figures fighting. That's where the action is. But what we don't notice, if you look at their legs, they're sinking in a swamp. They're so busy attacking each other that they haven't realized there is something far more dangerous than each other, and that's the world into which they're sinking. And Serres makes the point then to introduce the world itself is the most important thing within this scene. It is the background, it's the context, it is the thing in which all human activity is placed. Now, in Facing Gaia, Professor Latour makes another move on that, the very idea of the world as a third, the idea of the globe as something separate, the idea that there is any meaningful distinction to be made between these actors and the world in which they act is itself a problem, is itself a myth. And the figure of the Anthropocene, if nothing else, is about restoring the fact that we are a part of the world. Makes no sense to think of humanity as different to the world in which and through which we act. So, three brief remarks then, departing from that. The phrase critical zone, which comes from natural science to refer to the space where everything is happening, and it's worth thinking in terms of the Earth. There's only a very small slice of it that we inhabit as humans. There's only a very small slice of it. And the thin layer, the sublunary layer where all of the activity occurs is quite difficult for us to think. And Professor Latour referred to this problem of the big and the small. It's difficult to think of these things at a gigantic scale without an image of the globe, which almost perversely then shrinks it down to something that we can manage. And in Facing Gaia, he talks about people spinning the globe as a kind of an image of our hubris, this idea that we imagine we could ever have mastered the world. But this idea of a critical zone I like because it plays on this word critical in various ways. So there is critique in the sense of resisting, of saying no, of analysis, and there's also going critical in the sense of uranium going critical, something that is approaching a threshold, a destructive threshold. Now, I guess I should make a few comments about how then to think about this relationship to business, or as I would prefer to think about it, management and organisation studies to some extent. What does it mean to think about what business means in a critical zone, to think about business in a space where everything is going critical? It would suggest that the kind of established curriculum that we teach our students becomes pretty much meaningless when we have to start from the Anthropocene, when we have to start from the notion that there are not just economic stakeholders, but there's an innumerable mass of different stakeholders with whom negotiations, contests and struggles need to occur. It suggests that we would need a business curriculum that itself went critical, that we don't really understand the nature of the skills that we have to equip our students for in such a world. So I guess what I would say is, well, what university would be brave enough then to support a critical business school, or a business school going critical? I wonder. Another remark, in Facing Gaia, Professor Latour talks a lot about departing from the Galilean example, it moves. This feeling of how to register movement, how to register the affects that are required in the Anthropocene. And throughout Facing Gaia, Professor Latour talks a lot about we're being driven crazy by this. We're going mad, we're going out of our minds, we're trying to think about this. Now, to put that in a slightly different language, to think about mental health, to think about the relationship between climate change and mental health. You know, it seems to me that in Down to Earth, Professor Latour lists a range of things which he insists need to be thought together. These include climate denial, migration, inequalities. So these I want to add mental health as part of that. Seems to me this is a latent question throughout all of Facing Gaia. How is it that we will cope if we think of mental health as our receptivity to others and to the world, as our forms of attunement to what's going on around us? Then the whole notion of entering into a new climactic regime does something very different, I think, to how we think about mental health. And on that grounds, I want to say, you know, thinking this relationship between the environment in the small sense, the environment in this broader sense, becomes absolutely critical if we're thinking about mental health. And I think some of the work done by Paula Reevey and colleagues, for example, I think is very illuminating in trying to think, even start to think about what might be at stake in mental health terms through this change. So the last thing, to go back to this idea of too big and too small, and Professor Latour said, only if you've been through actor network theory can you understand this perverse relationship between big and small. Naturally, of course, having been through actor network theory, I'm very much taken with this idea. But I just want to pause on it a little bit longer. So classically within actor network theory, the principal move is to suggest that what we call an actor is first of all an activity, it's an action, which only subsequently acquires a name. And when we think about actants, we have to think about this movement between something that acts to then something that is given a proper name. So there's a reduction then of agency, or rather a redistribution of agency, as Professor Latour puts it, to a whole manner of things that we didn't expect were actants. I entirely, you know, what is to disagree about that? But I do just want to say, within that, there's a perversity, isn't there? That, you know, with the new climactic regime, the global north was the first to benefit from these activities, and it's the kind of last to feel the pain to some extent within that. I wonder what happens to people who never really felt they had much agency, and now even the attempt of getting agency is now being taken away. And I do think there is something fascinating, particularly in Down to Earth, about how to reconfigure and how to return to different notions of the political that comes about through this, maybe there was only a brief period of human history where the idea of agency ever worked, you know, 1610 to 1950 or something like that. And after this, you know, but then to have reconstructed the political and the version of this lack of agency, of course this has been Professor Latour's project for a very long time. This seems to me to be an incredibly difficult and challenging task.
I come at this as a historian. My name's Chris Williams. I work in the same university as Steve. I was interested in what you said about the subjectivity compared in terms of the views of the Earth created by Galileo and by Lovelock and Margulis, and how Galileo theorized the ability of humanity to see the Earth in space. And whereas later on, the Lovelock hypothesis is all about being centered on the planetary view. But it strikes me that something else was also going on at the same time, which may have had more influence in this gradual shift of human subjectivity towards understanding the world system, which is the arrival of that actual view. So you've got Earthrise in 1968, you've got the pale blue dot pictures from Voyager in 1990, which actually provide these sold as realistic, actually realistic images, which create that human subjectivity. So my question for you is, to what extent do we need to have Lovelock's hypothesis creating this new ecological awareness? Sorry, I used the word ecological. And to what extent, though, is it actually more of an outgrowth of our ability resulting from the technosphere to, for the first time as individuals, imagine ourselves easily standing outside the planet?
Well, of course, it's very interesting to realize that the whole, and it's a paradox which has been often shown by Lovelock himself and by historians, that it's entirely relying on the space age technology, and that the very idea of the Earth being different from the rest of the planet is actually coming from this moment between the 1950s and the 1980s. So there is a whole history I want not to brief here, connecting. There is a very interesting exhibition in Berlin a few years back on the Order of Catalog, which shows all of this sort of bouillonnement, vortex of interesting elements, Gaia, drugs, Buckminster, the whole argument about the development of alternative ways of living, all ending up with Reagan. So there is a very interesting moment in which the whole sort of Californian movement triggers one side Gaia and the other side Reagan, so to speak. But Lovelock's politics is, of course, extremely ambiguous. His political view are actually awful. So I'm not very much interested in political ideas of Lovelock. I'm interested in this very strange concept linking Margulies' work and Lovelock, because it breaks down the notion of a globe. So it's paradoxically, I agree, because of course the view of the Earth, the famous blue planet, should be considered as a great moment, but it has also great unfortunate consequences to believe a globe is actually accessible. I mean, as I think John mentioned before, the globe is not accessible. The globe has to be composed. And it's why all of the argument I've made try to break down this globe, which paralyzes the discussion, because it's immediately give people an idea that they are overlooking. That's why it's called the view from outer space. But maybe I misunderstood the question, in which case I will talk to you after that. Sorry, I go to treatment and I have difficulty hearing, so don't worry if I don't answer your question.
A question at the back? Sorry, just behind you. Yep, please.
Thank you. Question for either of the speakers to an extent. Mark Johnson from Bishop Grosseteste University. We cannot control the Earth system, which was sort of indicated in both, which my research focuses on, but there are concrete responses to that are already in place. So, using a blind horse model of precaution, things like permaculture are more appropriate to business, things like the natural step, exist and, can be made to work. The problem is sort of the lack of political economy, lack of political will. How would you like to take that on?
There are a number of solutions to the ecological crisis, like permaculture, but the problem is the lack of political will.
Yeah, well, yeah. But do we have solution when there is no politics? I mean, what is a solution which has no politics behind? I mean, yes, we have lots of solutions, but we have no politics. It means that the solution were not there. A solution is when the politics is there. Politics has to be aligned. So I know there are lots of questions. In fact, in many ways, people have already moved. People have already landed. I mean, it goes in every different field. People have already getting into this idea of landing. But there is no public representation of that change, of that shift. I think that's the point. The little kids who are demonstrating in the street every week, in fact, they have already moved out of that. I mean, they already fought and taken what you were mentioning at the end of your presentation. So what does it mean to say that there is no politics behind the many solutions we have? It's another way of saying that there is no public representation of the mass of changes people have already undergone, because the other view is still the sort of modernist view, so to speak. And I don't know how to approach this question except by following what John mentioned, which is a redefinition of territory. So politics is weak because there is no territory behind politics. I mean, it's very clear in the Brexit example I gave, it seems to me. When you ask people what is their opinion about identity, people who have no territory, they answer with the last thing they heard on Facebook. Because they have no interest in a way, because they have no land. They have no definition of a place where they actually sit. So the whole parallel I did with socialism is that the whole movement from the end of the 19th century to maybe the mid-1950s was reloading the whole political will and energy with description of a practical problem and the practical injustice done in the system of production. Then people had position. Then they were not that much influenced by rumors or all sort of fake news, although there were plenty of fake news and rumors. If people are now influenced so much by fake news and rumors, it's because they have no land. So they answer whatever is coming to their social network, so to speak, which I call asocial, desocializing network. So instead of saying we have a solution and there is no politics, I am asking why there is no politics, because there is no land described. And the task of people like John, or people like all of the people who are interested here in relocalizing and rematerializing and retailizing the Anthropocene, is to give a land to politics. And then we will have the energy, and people will begin to see who is their friend and enemies. Again, this is the admirable movement of the Brexit, is that in 3 years people moved from one, well, maybe it's not that good, but people were interrogated into a question of identity, and then they realized later that if the question had been in question defining your territory, the answer would have been different, let's say. I think that's a fair description of a Brexit event. If you interrogate people, what is your identity? They say, we are not part of Europe. If you ask them, what are your attachments? They say, well, we depend a lot on them because of that, and there are trucks coming then, and so on. So the question of reloading politics with a description of a territory is, I think, the key issue. Maybe if I understood your question.
Thanks. Question just in front there. Yep.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read my question. It's for Professor Latour. Could you elaborate a bit more on the primacy of the production question over the distribution question? I mean, would you say that the distribution question is completely overcome, given especially the persistency of interconnected systems of exploitation and unscrupulous extraction? That's it.
No, what I mean is that there is all of this question of the Anthropocene is directing attention to an antecedent, something which is foundational, if you want, which is we don't know the land on which we reside. We realize that it's made of lots, I mean, we could have, but we have actually paid no attention. The whole modernist movement was supposed to be a progress, but they never mentioned the climate question. People have talked about progress since the 17th century, never mentioning the temperature in which we will all live on. I mean, this is a simple dramatic example, but nor did they mention the CO2 component. And suddenly all these things are coming back. So this is why the two things are... now, socialism started with those questions in the 19th century and then degenerated, if you want to say, into a simple problem. Okay, production is one question and redistribution of production is another question. And that's the one we are basically the social democrat movement are trying to cope with in the 20th century. Now, is there another question now? Yes, there is another question, because it's no longer a production question. It's a question of having actually the product themselves, to generate the entities with which the products are actually produced. And that goes from not only humans, but as the Anthropocene study group shows, it's also about things like beaches or something like water, so salt or phosphorus. My friend Gaia is very worried by the phosphorus cycle. Every time I pee now into a water closet, I know it's a complete absurdity to let the phosphorus go. There is absolutely no phosphorus left in what, 50 years or something like that? And there is no way to replace phosphorus. We have to wait 100 millions of years because it comes back in rocks. So all of these things, they are part of the Earth, and we didn't know it was part of the Earth, and now it's back there. All of these questions are not answered or not enter into an argument about production and how to redistribute wealth. It's about the engendering of wealth itself. And it's very striking that in the demonstration of the little kids in the streets, so many of the affiche or slogan is about, should we have kids? It's a very interesting question. Should we have kids, really? Maybe not. Will the insect be left? I mean, all these questions are not questions about production, they are questions about, will there be entities generating their descendants later? That's not something that socialism in the tradition has absorbed, except in the mid-19th century, of course. So the question is, can we I mean, I'm doing a parallel here. As you understand, I'm trying to get out of the obsession with nature, which has blocked the ecological movement for so long, and say, okay, you ecologists who are in the same line as socialism, it's the same question again, that another type of entity, a larger group of entity, with reaction and also energy and power, has been misunderstood, and which we are learning bits after bits. Trucks after trucks. Just like realizing we are all like your minister in the parliament. Ah, my goodness, there are trucks crossing, yes. My goodness, there are CO2 coming in. Ah, my goodness, and then you kept hitting your skull, realizing that the list of entities with which the word is being made is much longer. That's what. It's not a question of distribution of wealth. Again, if I understood your question.
Thank you. That sounds like a fantastic moment to end this session. Can I ask you again to thank Professor Latour?